In this video, I'm going to explain the fallacy of equivocation. What is it to equivocate? Why is it fallacious? Let's consider. Hello philosophers, I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Consider the following argument. There's no such thing as true democracy. A government is only a true democracy if all of its citizens are free, but no one is truly free. All of our choices are determined by natural law, so there can't be such a thing as true democracy. What's interesting about this argument is that initially it might sound a little bit plausible. Unfortunately, it commits a fallacy of reasoning called equivocation. Let me give you an obvious example of this so that you see what I mean. Number one, light is not dark. Number two, all feathers are light. So number three, no feathers are dark. Now, hopefully you see in this argument that something is obviously wrong. Of course, we've seen feathers that are dark feathers. And yet premise one and premise two are both true, so what's going on here? Well, you may have already seen this, but the word light there is used in two different places, but it means two different things there. In one case, it means like photons, and in another case, it means something like light-weighted, like it's not heavy. So whereas on our first reading of this argument, it might seem like that word light means the same thing in two places because it looks identical. On a closer reading, we see that it can't be the case, that word light is being used in two different ways. And the same kind of error happens in that first argument. It looks something like this. Number one, democratic citizens are free, but number two, nobody is free. Therefore, number three, nobody is a democratic citizen. But think about that word freedom there. It's actually being used in two different ways. When we say the democratic citizens are free, what we mean is they are free from oppression, or maybe something like they are able to choose the things that they desire. Whereas in premise two here, when we say that nobody is free, we're using that word free to mean something a little bit different. We mean they're free as in they can choose totally apart from any kind of physical determination. This is libertarian free will, not the political libertarian, but if you're familiar with the free will idea in philosophy. And you could be free in the sense of premise one without being free in the sense of premise two. I mean, you might be able to pick the government that you desire, and yet those desires might be determined by your brain structure or something like that. So what is the fallacy of equivocation? It's when a word or a phrase has multiple meanings and ambiguity leads to a mistake in which one is correct in the situation. Note, by the way, that the term equivocation is a little bit confusing. It sounds like equal, so you think that word light, for example, you think, oh, those two words light are equal, so they must mean the same thing. No, that's not what equivocate means. It means actually the exact opposite of that. Two totally different meanings. Now, there are two types of equivocation that I'm going to talk about today. The first one is an equivocation as a fallacy of reasoning. First, our word or phrase appears more than once in the argument. And second, there's a shift of meaning in those two places that make it look like we have a valid argument when we really don't. By the way, side note, some philosophers have argued that you could have an equivocation with a word just appearing one time in the argument but appearing in the wrong way. I don't think that's possible. Maybe I'll write a blog post about it sometime, but it's not something that I want to get into right now. In any case, how does it invalidate the argument? Well, reasoning is all about connecting concepts and categories in certain ways and seeing what's entailed by that. An equivocation gives us the illusion that we're actually connecting a couple of concepts when really the connection never actually happens. Now, categorical logic actually has some nifty tools to help us to see this, so I'm going to use that. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Pretend you started a philosophy club at your school, and the director of clubs comes at you trying to charge you an exorbitant fee for your club. You say, why so much? Now consider this argument that the director of clubs might give you. Bi-weekly events must pay a buttload of money. The philosophy club meeting is a bi-weekly event, so the philosophy club meeting must pay a buttload of money. Now notice the way this all works. There are three categories of things here: philosophy club meetings, bi-weekly events, and things that cost a buttload. And all the things in the category of bi-weekly events are also in the category of things that cost a buttload. All the things in the category of philosophy club meetings are also in the category of bi-weekly events. So hopefully you can see that by being related to that bi-weekly events category, we see that the philosophy club meetings are actually also connected to things that cost a buttload. In fact, we could take out that middle term, that middle category, bi-weekly events, and all of a sudden we see that philosophy club meetings is inside of that category of things that cost a buttload. So in categorical logic, this is how reasoning works. But notice that word bi-weekly. I don't know if you knew this, but it actually can mean meets every other week or meets twice a week, which makes it an incredibly frustrating word. So now imagine that in our philosophy club, we only meet every other week, and our director of clubs is talking about things that make twice a week. Well, now we see that everything in the category of twice a week events is also in the category of things that cost a buttload. Everything that's in the category of philosophy club meetings is also in the category of things that meet every other week. Are things in the philosophy club meetings category also related to the things that cost a buttload category? I don't know, maybe they are, but by this reasoning, we wouldn't know. So notice it seemed to us like we had one category connecting the two other categories in the conclusion, but really what we had was two separate categories that were connected to two other categories, and never the twain shall meet. So we can't get a conclusion from these premises, but because of that equivocation, it looked like we could, and we might be deceived into thinking that we did. By the way, in categorical logic, what we just saw was called a four-term fallacy. Category 1 is connected to category 2 is connected to category 3, therefore category 1 is connected to category 3. Now, obviously, if you switch out a fourth category in there somewhere, fourth term, then your reasoning is going to be unsuccessful. And notice, when we know that there's a fourth category there, it's obviously fallacious. You know, category 1 related to category 2, category 4 related to category 3, therefore 1 is related to 3. Doesn't seem like it. So why would anybody make that mistake? Well, it's almost always because of an equivocation, because you thought you were using the same category twice when really there was a totally different category in there. And of course, I showed you that using categorical logic. Same would go for predicate or propositional logic. So that's what an equivocation is. You may wonder, why do we make this mistake? Why do we equivocate in giving arguments? One reason that I think might be possible is that we look from the premises to the overall structure, and we kind of get lost in shifting our focus. And here's what I mean. In my introduction to logic courses, I've taught students this fallacy using that feather example at the beginning, which is clearly false, but I walked them through it. I said, light is not dark. Everybody agree? Yes. All feathers are light. Still thumbs up. Therefore, no feathers are dark. Right? And you'd be shocked at how many classes all said yes. And I look around like, you guys have seen crows, right? But the thing is, they're so locked in on trying to evaluate the structure that they totally miss the meanings of the word. So I think that's one possible mistake, but that's usually just going to happen in logic classes. And really, that reason why that feather is light example is so obviously false is because that word light, even though it's the exact same word in two places, the meaning is so different that it's obvious that can't be right. Really, I think where people make this mistake most often is when you have a word that's used in two places, same exact physical word, right? Same exact letters and everything. But in both places, it means something slightly different, and that meaning affects your reasoning. For example, I think that's exactly why that argument about freedom at the very beginning seemed at least somewhat plausible. Freedom from oppression and freedom from natural laws, you know, those are different things, and yet they're also similar in a way, so it's easy to confuse them. In fact, freedom is one of the most notoriously confusing concepts, I think. I see people making that mistake all the time. So yeah, I think an equivocation usually happens when you're using the same word twice and they mean kind of the same thing, but they mean something different enough that it invalidates your reasoning. So that's why we might make this error. Now let's check out what we might do about it. First, how do you identify an equivocation? Well, if you see a wacky conclusion that comes from two really innocuous looking premises, I think there's a good chance that an equivocation has happened. So what you want to do is take a careful look at the complex concepts that are in those premises. Words like freedom, of course, being or existence, rights, persons. There are all these philosophically loaded concepts. I would check those out and see if they haven't shifted meaning in those premises. I would also look for hidden assumptions. What would it take to make this premise true? For example, to make that we're not all free premise true, you have to assume that every event is determined and that being determined is incompatible with having free will. Whereas for that whole democratic societies are free, all we need is that people are not being forced by some kind of government to do something. So the assumptions don't seem to match up for those two concepts, even though they're the same identical word. Probably they're two different meanings. What are some tips for avoiding actually committing this fallacy? Well, I think you have to be really careful with the concepts that you're using, and honestly, that only comes with a lot of philosophy. You have to really be thoughtful, and you have to spend some time with these concepts. And to do so, I suggest that you subscribe to the Philosopher Show, where we spend all kinds of time talking about these concepts. However, another suggestion I have for you that you won't always have the opportunity to do is to write out the whole argument and look at the different premises and those different concepts in there and see if you can replace them with the same synonyms. So for example, in the feather argument, I could replace that second light in there, the all feathers are light, I could replace that with not heavy, but I couldn't replace that in the first premise with the same synonym. What if somebody else has committed this fallacy? How do you respond to it? This, I think, is actually a little bit more difficult because a lot of times people will use these concepts, and especially when you're talking, you know, you're not emailing things out so that you can have it written out and we can all look at it. When you're talking about them, these concepts just get all jumbled up in people's heads. So the first step to dealing with any fallacy is to point out that it's happened, but once you've done so, later on in the argument, people still make the same equivocation error. It happens all the time. I think one good way to deal with it then is to substitute in those synonyms. So for example, in the bi-weekly one, you substitute in happens every other week and happens twice a week. Then all of a sudden it's very clear that the argument is committing an equivocation. Unfortunately, things aren't always that easy because there's not always synonyms. And in that case, I think it's always good to add an additional word, or if you're writing it down, a subscript. So for example, in the light argument, in the first occurrence of light, there really isn't a synonym for that kind of a light. So I think you could put like a word visible in front of it. Visible light versus lightweight. And if it's too cumbersome, maybe when you're writing it out, you can write light with a subscript V on there so that we know we're talking about this specific kind of light. But in a conversation, obviously you can't put any subscripts or anything. So it's very important that you keep repeating exactly what category you're talking about. Visible light. Now that's how the fallacy happens in reasoning. There's also a way for this fallacy to happen in communication. In reasoning, what was important is that that word or phrase occurs more than one time and it shifts meaning between those two occurrences in such a way to invalidate the argument. In communication, the word or phrase still has more than one meaning, but it doesn't necessarily have to appear more than one time. Instead, what happens is that the speaker meaning is different from the communicated meaning. And there are two ways that that can happen. Imagine you're going off telling me how bad your school is, and then out of nowhere I tell you, I'm on the board. What would you think? You'd think, oh, this guy's on the board of directors. He's gonna help me out. He's offering to help me. He's gonna make things better. You go around telling all your friends, don't worry, we got somebody in high up places. And then all of a sudden I say to you, no, I'm not on the board of directors. And you say, but you told me I'm on the board. No, I'm on the plank, right? The wooden piece of material on that board. I was just telling you I'm on the board. Now notice the word board here has two meanings. It could mean a wooden plank, or it could mean a group of people that are in charge of something. Now one of the ways that we communicate is by saying relevant things. Or if they're irrelevant, we explain that they're irrelevant. And me saying that I'm on the board was a totally irrelevant thing to say just out of nowhere. So you can see how my intended meaning of that word board is not the actually communicated meaning of that word board. So here's how equivocation happens in communication when you make a mistake. The word that's used has more than one meaning, and the shift in meaning happens between the speaker's intended meaning and the listener's received meaning. Now, I can't get too deep into this without going really far down a philosophy of language rabbit hole, but the mistake is going to have to be on the speaker's side. The listener obviously can make a mistake in what the meaning is, but if it's going to be an equivocation, it's going to be the speaker's fault. But how could it be the speaker's fault? Again, question for philosophy of language, which I'd love to talk about sometime. But this disparity between the speaker's intended meaning and the listener's received meaning, or the communicated meaning, or whatever you want to call it, is oftentimes exploited in deception. Now, before I give you this one, I want to let you know that I'm not trying to be political. I see a lot of logic teachers that give a lot of logical fallacy examples, and they're all on one side of the political spectrum. And I don't want to be that guy, but I do want to give you examples that have some real bite to them, some real world implications. So I'll do my best to give you examples on both sides of the political spectrum. This one is all about when Bill Clinton was in trial for inappropriate relations, we'll say. I'm going to try my best to keep this G-rated. So here's the story. Clinton was being sued for R-rated harassment, and he was investigated for inappropriate relationship with a young lady. And his lawyer said, there is no inappropriate relationship. Now, later on, it was found out that Clinton did have an inappropriate relationship with this person. And after getting busted, he was asked about that question before a grand jury. They said, your lawyer said there is no inappropriate relation. That's false, correct? He told us something false. And Clinton infamously said, that depends on what the meaning of is. Is can mean is and never has been. So for example, if I tell you there is no perfect society, what I'm doing is telling you that that is just a fiction. It's never happened before and it's not happening right now. But is can also mean is right now with no reference to the past. For example, if I say there is no ice cream in the freezer, Clinton pointed out that even though there is no inappropriate relationship was false in the first sense, it was true in the second sense. So Clinton argued, it's not a lie. Let's call these two instances is present and past and is present only. And notice how this all goes down very similar to the mistake equivocation of communication. You have the speaker's intended meaning, which is the is present only. You have the listener's received meaning, which is the is present and past. The bizarre twist here is that the speaker says that his intended meaning was that is present only, and he also intended for the listener not to have that meaning. He intended the listener to take that is, present, and past meaning. So there's two intentions here. The meaning that the speaker intends the words to have, and the meaning that the speaker intends the listener to believe he intended. I actually was hoping to get a lot further into this, but now that I'm saying it, I realize that this is just way too big of a topic for us to do in this equivocation video, because it's an interesting question. Is this a lie, or is it deceiving without lying? And if it's deceiving without lying, is it just as good as a lie? Is it better than a lie, or is it worse than a lie? You know, we say things like, well, technically it wasn't a lie, as if that makes it better than a lie. But then you might feel that somebody deceiving me by twisting words, oh, I hate that. I wish they would just lie to me. Or you may just shrug and say, well, it's not a lie, but may as well be. In any case, that's the second kind of equivocation that we can make in communication. Not that we make a mistake, but when we're intending to deceive somebody by shifting meaning. Now, why we make this kind of equivocation is obvious, right? Either we're not being careful with our words, or we're intentionally trying to deceive somebody. But what do we do about this kind of equivocation? Well, I don't really have tips for you on how to identify it. You know, if somebody's being just goofy, then hopefully you could see that. But if somebody's trying to deceive you, you know, that's a whole kind of wisdom question that hopefully you're wise enough to see when somebody is trying to twist words. As far as how do we avoid making this fallacy, to avoid making the mistake, I think we really have to be careful about what people would be thinking about while we're communicating to them. You know, what is relevant to them at the time? What do they think that I would intend? Those kind of questions are the things. So we have to really put ourselves into the person we're talking to. We have to put ourselves into their shoes and think, you know, what would they be expecting of me? I won't give you any tips on how to avoid deceiving people, though. That'd be a totally different video. How do you respond to this fallacy? What do you do if somebody is equivocated in this way? Well, if they've made the mistake, then I think you just point out that how would I have thought that? Especially think about the board example, right? I think you say, why would I have thought about you standing on a board? You should have called my attention to it, right? Like, we're talking about one thing that was totally irrelevant. So I think just pointing it out helps a person to see, like, oh yeah, that wasn't really what was communicated there, was it? But what about the deception one? Here, I think it's more important to point out, not necessarily to get into the argument, is that a lie or isn't that a lie, but point out the fact that it's the deception all the same. I think you say something like, look, you knew what I thought you would have meant. You purposely said it that way so that I would think something that wasn't true. Whether it's a lie or not, you were deceiving me. But honestly, to get into the argument of whether it actually was a lie or whether it's good as a lie, that's going to be a red herring and video on red herring sometime soon. I don't know, but it's just going to totally take you off on a different tangent when really the problem is that that person tried to deceive you. Well, that's what's important to know about equivocation. If you have any questions about it, please hit me up in the comments. And that's all I got for today. Adios.